My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are in the midst of I tell you, I'm loving this study. I hope you are. And from all the private messages and the conversations I've been having, you're enjoying it too, and that's why I enjoy sharing with you. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that the resurrection would be when sin, the sting of death, would be overcome. To deal with sin is to deal with death. That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 6, where Paul is dealing with Adam, sin, and death, and Christ, righteousness, resurrection, and life. We've been focused on Romans chapter 6 because Romans chapter 6, the first several verses really gives us into insight, and it lays the foundation for much of what Paul will say in chapter 7 and 8. And I've been focusing on the fact that Paul's focus on the death, the burial, and resurrection of Christ has to do with his doctrine of Adam's sin and death and Christ's righteousness, resurrection, and life. Have you really caught the power of Paul saying, if we have been buried with Christ in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection? Now notice what Paul adds to this. Knowing this. Knowing what? That to be united with Christ, death, to be united with Christ's resurrection is everything. Knowing that to be united with Christ in the likeness of his death, and knowing that to be united with Christ in the likeness of his resurrection points to the then future resurrection in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, our old man was crucified with him. Now watch this. That the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. Now, wait a minute. He's talking to biologically living individuals, and he says, when you were buried with Christ in the likeness of his death, when you were joined with Christ in the likeness of his resurrection, that the old man, oh, but wait, that's not what he says. What did he say? What did he say? That the body of sin might be done away. What did you say, Paul? Paul said, I'm telling you right now, to be joined with Christ in the likeness of his death, to be joined with Christ in the likeness of his burial, to be joined with Christ in the likeness of his resurrection, is to put away, to destroy, to put to death the body of sin. For what purpose? That we might be a new person. That the old man might be put away. Now, I've shared with you in past videos, I'm not going to go into great detail on this, of Paul's doctrine of the two men. There is the old man, which Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, 22 and following, is corrupt according to deceitful lust. You remember our conversation of the word corruption? Phthora? And how that refers to moral corruption, a life given over to the flesh, a life lived in opposition to God. Has nothing to do with biological corruption. So here is Paul continuing that kind of discussion, saying that to be buried with Christ, to be raised with Christ, puts the old man, the body of sin, it puts him away. It's the same physical body. Right? It's the same human being in mortal flesh, right? And yet for Paul, he says that to be buried with Christ in baptism into his death, buried with him, and to be raised with him in the likeness of his death was for that physical person living in a mortal body. It was to put to death the body of sin. You see, Paul is talking here in terms that you and I, in our Western way of thinking, are simply not familiar enough with, because we don't think in Hebraic terms. We don't see ourselves living in a body of life or a body of death, because we fail to think abstractly like Paul does, like the Hebrews did, in regard to their standing before God. To live a life of the flesh, not this, but to live a life of the flesh was to be the old man. It was to exist in a body of death. We'll have more to say about that in chapter 7. Just think ahead to Paul's discussion where he says, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death?" Oh, wait a minute. Paul, didn't you just say right here in chapter 6 that to be buried with Christ in baptism, to be raised with Christ in the likeness of his resurrection? Didn't you just say, if we have been buried with Christ, that we put to death the old man? Well, yeah, here's an already but not yet. Because Paul says, here's what happened, but we're still looking for this. Here's what happened, but who shall deliver me from this body of death? Isn't the body of sin the same body of death? The same as the body of death? If it's not, what's the difference? I've never had anybody answer that question, by the way. You know, a lot of the adversaries of covenant eschatology say, oh, well, yeah, there was spiritual resurrection in the first century as every person was converted to Christ, and they were buried with Christ, and they were raised with Christ. That's spiritual resurrection. That was over. Then how do we explain the fact that Paul is saying, okay, when you were raised with Christ, you put to death the body of sin, but he was still looking for deliverance from that body of death? How do you explain the fact that he's talking about the likeness of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, not a precise equivalency to it? You see, folks, the traditional views of Paul's doctrine of body of life, body of death, body of sin, body of flesh, those are not the modern day concepts of flesh and body of sin and body of death. Am I living in a body of death on a biological level? Well, of course I am, because every man will die biologically. But according to Paul, when we're buried with Christ by baptism, we're baptized into his death, baptized into a likeness of his resurrection, and we put that old man, the body of sin, to death. We are delivered now, this side of the fulfillment of those things, we are delivered from the body of death. I have not been delivered from the biological, physical body that will ultimately die. But if I am in Christ, what did Paul say? No, you're not. That so many of us, as are baptized into Christ, have put on Christ. What was his two Adam doctrine? As in Adam all men die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Paul's concept of life and death, Paul's concepts of body of flesh, body of sin. You know, the modern concepts, the modern definitions of those things cannot deal with Paul's doctrine of the body of sin and the body of death and being in Adam and being in Christ on a biological level. Just can't do it. So we'll see you on the flip side.